Good evening, everyone, and welcome to A Pocket Guide to Slavery, a lecture and discussion on the history of pockets in enslaved people's clothing and its modern implications in African American dress. This event is moderated and organized by students in FIT's Fashion and Textile Studies MA program in conjunction with the exhibition Pockets to Purses, Fashion and Function. Images from the exhibition are up on the screen, showing the hard work of our teams. In the second year of study, students in the Fashion and Textile Studies History, Theory, and Museum Practice Master of Arts program in FIT's School of Graduate Studies work in collaboration with the museum at FIT to create and install an exhibition. This process is a unique experience and a key feature of the Fashion and Textile Studies program. The year-long course prepares students to enter workforce as curators, conservators, registrars, or museum educators. The class handles every aspect of the exhibition process, from concept to completion, including research, design, publications, and related events. The students draft proposal ideas in the spring of the previous year, and the museum selects the most viable topic. In-depth research begins in the summer, and the class formally begins to review and refine their exhibition thesis collectively in the fall. They are then divided into groups with specific roles and responsibilities. The editorial team consists of writers, editors, and researchers. They drive the final object selection and generate the bulk of the written material for the exhibition. This group works closely with the design and education teams to ensure the narrative of the topic is properly represented. The design team is responsible for exhibition and graphic design, as well as serving as the conservation consultants. Their goal is to create a visitor experience that reinforces the curatorial focus, while ensuring that the objects are shown in a manner that addresses consideration of appropriate conditions. They work closely with the other teams to create a unified vision for the exhibition. The public team crafts the public message for the exhibition through educational programs, publications, and press coverage. This group also acts as a class support team, assisting with research, image rights, and budgeting. They work closely with the curators to ensure that the public has a richer experience and understanding of the topic. Their hard work has produced this event. This evening, we are joined by writer and historian Dr. Jonathan Michael Square. He specializes in Afro-diasporic fashion and visual culture. He currently teaches at Harvard University, where his research and pedagogy explores the intersection of fashion and slavery in the African diaspora. He has a PhD in history from New York University, a master's degree from the University of Texas at Austin, and a BA from Cornell University. Jonathan has written for Fashionista, International Journal of Fashion Studies, Refinery 29, Hyperallergic, and Fashion Studies Journal. He also founded and currently runs the digital humanities project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, a curated platform that explores intersections between slavery and the fashion system. Dr. Square will present a short lecture on the subject of pockets in African American fashion, after which he will be joined on the stage by my colleague Darnell Lisby for discussion. We will be accepting questions at the end of the event via note card, which will be passed around by my colleagues and then collected. Please hold your questions until that time. If you would like to post about this event, we hope you will use our hashtag #PocketsToPurses. Thank you for joining us this evening, and without further ado, Dr. Jonathan Square.
Let me get my mic. Excuse me. How are you guys doing? All right. I just want to start off by thanking Karen Van Horn and Sarah Bird. And I also would like to thank Emma McClendon, who was the museum liaison for the exhibition. And I'd also like to thank the brilliant students who are in the FIT's Fashion and Textiles MA program. And I want to give a special shout out to Carson Poplin and Darnell Lisby. So if you haven't seen the exhibition, please go check it out. It's amazing. So I'm going to jump right into my lecture. First off, it's truly a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I hope you can take something away from this lecture. So, all right. So actually, before I jump into this, I want to go start with this line drawing. This is a classic line drawing that often accompanied runaway slave ads. And the reason I started with this image is because it sort of marries my research interest, which is the relationship between fashion and slavery, and the focus of the exhibition, which is on pockets and purses and bags. So this is an excerpt from a book by Lydia Parrish, who was an ethnographer/anthropologist. And she wrote a book, let me get the name right, Slave Songs of the Georgia Sea Islands, which explores the folklore and song of the Gullah people. And I included this page because there's a footnote in, first off, before I explain the footnote, I want to say that slave dress for children was very androgynous. They often only wore a shirt tail or a smock or just a shapeless shift. So it was, once they reached puberty, then they would start wearing trousers or dresses. So when you got your first pair of pants, it was a big sort of rite of passage. And that's what's being described in the footnote. She spoke with the formerly enslaved man. This book was published in 1942. So in 1942, there were still some formerly enslaved peoples who were still alive. Of course, they were elderly, but she spoke with a few people who had been enslaved in their youth. And one of those people was Shad Hall, and he described his first pair of pants, which were missing pockets to prevent him from stealing. But of course, not all slaves' clothing were missing pockets. So this is an example of a garment that does have pockets. And actually, this garment was made entirely by slaves. So it was woven, homespun, and sewn by slaves. And as you can see, the sleeveless jacket includes 2 pockets on the front. And I suspect that this garment was made for special occasions. It wasn't something you would wear in the field or when you were working. This was a garment for special occasions. So it was unusual for enslaved children to have garments, 2-piece garments. So I think that's what signifies this is a special garment. I wanted to include this image. This is Peter Swally, who also went by Mary Jones. Mary Jones was a prostitute and pickpocket who worked in Lower Manhattan. She was arrested in 1836, and she told the police that she'd been cross-dressing in balls throughout New York and New Orleans. And I included this image for a number of reasons. I think for the purposes of this talk, she's carrying a bag or a reticule. And I also think the image is fairly flattering. Of course, the caption is horrific and problematic for a number of reasons, which I don't have to explain here. But considering other images of African Americans in the early 19th century, I would say that this image is actually pretty flattering. So I'll just show you this, which is 2 drawings by an illustrator named Edward Williams Clay. And he did a series also in the early 19th century. These are from 1828, so maybe 8 years earlier than the image that I just showed. But as you can see here, the images sort of make a mockery of African Americans' purchasing power and their upward mobility. And the depiction is very grotesque, it's very stereotypical, very racist. So when you compare these images to the previous image, you see that this is, for a number of reasons, is flattering. When I showed this image to Sarah, one of the things she said was, maybe it was just a lazy illustrator. This is just a, a bookplate that they used for something else, and they decided to paint the woman black. So it's interesting to think about. But nevertheless, I still think it's pretty flattering. And considering other depictions other depictions of trans Black women, I think this one is pretty unique in a lot of ways. Now I want to pause on these two images for a bit. These are actually Brooks Brothers coats, and they were made for enslaved men. So, most people don't make the association between slave dress and Brooks Brothers. Like, this is the image that you see when you think of Brooks Brothers. But Brooks Brothers is a centuries plus old firm, and so they actually manufactured fabric and clothing for plantation owners. So when I showed this image to the museum practicum class, I included it because I suspected there were pockets in it, but I was delighted to realize Carson was actually writing her final paper on these coats. And she had spoken with the costume historian at the New Orleans Historic Collection, which is where these coats are held. And she sent me a very detailed report on these coats. And as you can see, they're actually full of pockets, which is really interesting for a number of reasons. And one of the things one of the students said in the class was that it conveyed a certain level of trust on the part of the owner, that they gave their slave a coat full of pockets. They were assuming that the slave wasn't pilfering or stealing eggs or flour from them. So it was a marker of privilege. And actually, the costume historian is Lydia Blackmore. She's not a conservator, a costume historian who did this report. So now I want to talk a little bit about aprons, and I actually brought a prop with me. Because in the 18th and 19th centuries, women would wear these tie-on pockets. Of course, they would wear them underneath their petticoats. But this is another example, and there's actually one in the exhibition too. But there are also these aprons that free women of color and also enslaved women wore, and domestics and also market women. So this is an example of a market woman, and this, of course, is after slavery at the turn of the century in Jamaica. But enslaved women would have worn similar aprons as this. And so these aprons were long aprons. They typically came past in these and they had 2 deep pockets where they kept the implements of their trade. For domestic slaves, the pockets were also functional, but I think they also conveyed a certain level of authority, the fact that they were allowed to have a garment with pockets in them. And I just have a few more images that I want to show you. This is more market women in Jamaica. Market women, again, long aprons. You can't really see the pockets, but they typically had 2 deep pockets along the front of the apron. Oops. So now I want to jump into the 20th century, which is outside of the purview of the exhibition. Well, actually, I do talk 20th century. But Zoot Suits are outside of the purview of the exhibition. But I think of exhibitions as conversations. They can't be definitive. They sort of foster conversations that sort of reach outside the purview of the exhibition. So one thing that came to mind, thinking about the topic of pockets, purses, bags, was baggy silhouettes in a zoot suit. So these are 3 images of young men wearing zoot suits, which, very baggy suits with a long blazer, sort of peg leg silhouette on the pant. And so I think the zoot suit is sort of the predecessor of a modern trend, which is sagging. And it's interesting to think about the zoot suit and sagging being in conversation with each other. I think both are forms of resistance, but also a provocation, but also protection. It's a way to protect yourself from a criminalizing gaze or exoticizing gaze. And particularly the image on the left, I think it's like the zenith of the sagging trend. The extreme sagging, like down to the thighs with the long tee covering your upper thighs. And also thinking about the zoot suit and sagging and sort of billowing excessive fabric also makes me think of the hood. And this is the Trayvon Martin's hood in the trial of George Zimmerman. But the hood is the hood is like, I think of it as like a pocket for your head. But of course, like pockets, it's a functional part of a garment. Trayvon Martin was wearing a hood because it was drizzling the night that he was shot. So he was protecting his head from moisture. But of course, people wore hoodies in protest and in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. So this is a continued conversation. If you're interested in these topics of like fashion and slavery, please follow me on the social media platform of your choice. And we're gonna transition into a conversation with Darnell Lisby.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for that. That was a wonderful lecture, and I think it was very informative. And I guess jumping, is the clicker? Sorry, get it. Jumping right into, I guess, based on our exhibition that we did, and we've had several conversations about this, and what we're going to show you through this presentation as well is some of the objects that we hope that you all see before the exhibition closes in another week and some change. So that's a good plug for that. Moving right into it, the first comparison that we have on the right, we have this John Trumbull portrait of George Washington with his slave valet, William Billy Lee. And then on the left, we have a runaway advertisement from the North Carolina Star from 1809. And just to give a quick overview, the juxtaposition that we wanted to kind of show was basically a lot of research that you've made of this privilege of pockets within slave dress, in why some would and have pockets in their whatever they would wear, whether it's coats or breeches, and why others weren't allowed, which we kind of emphasize over in the exhibition. But what I do want to talk about is how, as a researcher, kind of switching gears, but as a researcher, how do you access a lot of this information? Being that this is a very touchy subject, and I think we talked about that, I talked with a few other people, that my mom, let's just say, it's a touchy subject to have slavery and fashion in the same sentence, especially for Black people specifically. So how do you find this research? And then the second question is, what language and terminology would you use?
That's a really good question. And I think one thing we've talked about in the past is access to archives. And I shared with the class that I've been trying to get access to Brooks Brothers archives for over a year. And I think they probably Google me and see my research, and they have not given me access to the archive. So it's, depending on the institution, it depends. Like Library of Congress is great. A lot of their stuff is online. But like more private companies, like for instance, you can't get access to that information. So it depends. But in terms of, your second question was on?
What terminology would you use in reference to slave dress? I don't know what's happening.
I I use the term fashion,
Okay.
which might be controversial. There are a lot of fashion scholars in the audience who might disagree with that. But I use the term fashion for just simply, I think when people hear fashion, they immediately understand what you're talking about. Whereas with costume or dress, it's a little more academic. So I use it just to connect with people. But I get where people are coming from when they say that, dress might be a more important term, or costume might be a more important term. Also, I think it's important to put slavery and fashion in conversation with each other, because most people don't make that association. So I think it's a provocative thing to put them next to each other and actually say that enslaved people were part and parcel to the beginning of the fashion system.
Were you ever concerned about the audience in terms of using that terminology, I guess?
In terms of like academics, or in terms of just the wider audience?
Both.
With academics, of course, I'm always very nervous because they're always like, please define your terms. What do you mean by fashion? Like, they'll come for you.
Yeah.
But the wider public, I think, doesn't think that much about it necessarily.
Okay.
So it's typically academics who really question that association.
Okay. And then moving to the next comparison that we have on the right, this is a photo of a pocket diary by Emily Frances Davis. She was a modiste, black woman in Philadelphia. And she, a dressmaker, milliner, all around fashionable woman, and worked in the I don't know if she was a fashion woman, but she was in the fashion system. And then you have here on the left a reproduction of W.E.B. Du Bois at the Paris Exposition in 1900. Even though, well, the comparison here that they're not necessarily by each other in the exhibition, which you'll see, but in this context, we have two black individuals that are in the fashion system and involved in that. And this is, even though that is Emily Frances Davis' pocket diaries 1864, and then you have the W.E.B. Du Bois in 1900s, like kind of encompassing of like this Civil War Reconstruction period. So what I was kind of drawn to in looking at these two different objects was understanding what was considered affluent in the black community, because a lot of museum collections, especially maybe here at MFIT, Costume Institute, other larger collections, a lot of the objects have come from socialites, people that, happen to be white people and of a particular status, and we know those names, and they had a certain wealth, so we can kind of monetize and have a captured image of what affluent was for them, but what was considered affluent and who was considered affluent for African Americans that would have been able to afford or be involved in the fashion system.
First off, kudos for you guys for including that image in the exhibition. I'm obsessed with it. The top hat, the three-piece suit, the fact that he has his hands in his pocket, as you guys brought out in the exhibition, I think it's a display of his power and his comfort with himself. And also, I think it's interesting to think about racemen like W. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington as being fashion icons. They're very much concerned about how they presented themselves. If you think about Frederick Douglass, he was the most photographed man in the 19th century. So they're very much thinking about their image and how they styled themselves. Even though I think if you talk to them, they probably wouldn't say that they're fashion icons. But I do think it's interesting to put them in that category.
Okay.
And so with W.E.B. Du Bois, very much the austere, very erudite academic. And I think he's sort of conveying that in this photo.
And to what degree would they have had access to fashion? In a sense, would women be able to participate in Paris couture? Would they go to Paris and buy things and bring it back to America? Or was the extent of them participating in the fashion system getting everything custom made or tailored?
Well, there are probably only a handful of people of African descent who were able to participate in the fashion system at the turn of the century. But they certainly saw images, and they certainly attempted to replicate the fashions through working with dressmakers and tailors. So, I mean, just for context, this image is actually taken in Paris. W. Du Bois curated a show called The American Negro, and this photo was taken while he was in Paris. So again, there are a handful of African Americans or people of African descent who were able to sort of participate in the wider, I wouldn't say he's participating in the fashion system, but he's sort of in that milieu. So were they directly involved? They weren't directly involved, but they were in conversation with it or in dialogue with it, and certainly sort of replicated those fashions.
And keeping in tune, I guess, with the early 20th century, we have these two comparisons here. On the left, we have a photo of Josephine Baker with her beautiful clutch on top of the table. In the exhibition, we really wanted to show this concept of gesture. And this was one of the ways that we were able to do it, either gesture, hands in the pockets, or how you carried your purse, how you carried your handbag, or how you place it in the settings around you. And then we had it in conjunction with this Cartier handbag. The clutch, disclosure, is not, that Josephine Baker has is not Cartier, but we thought it'd be like a good comparison because it almost looks the same. But I wouldn't be shocked if it was Cartier. But talking in terms of the early 20th century, how was fashion shaped by the Black community?
Well, I mean, speaking of fashion icons, Josephine Baker, she completely changed fashion in Paris. So, I mean, I think there was a dialogue. I think African Americans were shaping the wider fashion system, and the same was true with the wider fashion system. It was influencing the way African Americans dress. So particularly in the early 20th century. In the 19th century, there's less examples of that, but I think by the time we get to the early 20th century, we are seeing a dialogue between sort of mainstream American society and African American dress.
And myself knowing a little bit about Baker's story, why was France more accepting of her in the sense of being I guess, more or less a fashion icon than here in America?
She was definitely exoticized in France in a way that she wasn't here. And so she was able to play that up outside of the American context. So, and for whatever reason, in a particular time, particularly because of negrophilia, the French really were drawn to her and her affect.
Okay, so there is, I don't know if we can play the clip or that's not a thing. Okay, wow. In the exhibition, once again, towards the back of the layout, we have a video screen of several clips where we wanted to discuss this idea of more or less gender neutrality coming into our story of pockets and purses. For a majority of the exhibition, we generally talk about this idea of women's wear appropriating men's wear out of a necessity. But then as we move into the 21st century, we begin to discuss this idea of menswear now appropriating women's wear, but it's not out of a necessity, it's more or less because it's fashion. And then we have designers from Gaultier to, we also have a kimono coat by Yamamoto, showing this contrast between the two. And right under it, we have this screen with several clips, one from Seinfeld, episode from Friends, and then here from Beauty Shop of this idea of the merce, this man bag. So controversial, you know. It was scary stuff. Okay, get the plan. Okay.
So we'll make sure that you can go to the desk.
Yes.
Sorry about the technical difficulties.
So they were just making a little joke. He was just like, oh, what is that, a man bag? And then he's just like, yeah, it's the hottest men's fashion. They're like, you got some man lipstick? So, I mean, I think this is the leaning into something that specifically in the Black community we have years of grappling with when it comes to masculinity and understanding that root. And I kind of want to take the conversation in a way of understanding, because you talk about sagging, and it's just very interesting how sagging kind of exposes your body, especially the backside of your body. So why has the Black community accepted certain fashions like sagging to protect masculinity, but then they reject the merce, which is this combination of menswear and women's wear, when I feel like they're two sides of the same coin. So,
Absolutely. I think it's an interesting tension because there's something about sagging that's very sexualized in that you're sort of exposing part of your body to the world. But at the same time, I think there's something protective about it because at the same time you're exposing your body, you're sort of covering your body with a lot of fabric. And the same with the zoot suit. Like, there's something, a lot of the men who wore zoot suits also straightened their hair, which is, at the time was considered hyper-masculine, but at the same time there's something feminine about the act of straightening your hair. So it's interesting to think about that sort of tension between like hyper-masculinity, but also something that's slightly feminine, which I think is the same dynamic happening in that video.
and I guess, do you know, I guess off the top of your head, where this kind of revival of sagging came from? Because I feel like if you look at 20th century, you have Zoot Suit, but then it's kind of like it went to, waistlines got a little bit higher and higher and higher, and then they got kind of, I don't know, streamlined, and then it went to sagging, back to sagging in a way. But where do you think that trend had come from?
You know, that's a good question. One thing I've heard is that it's a trend that came from prison wear, and that the tendency of men in prison to wear their pants baggy in an effort to hide contraband. I don't know how true that is, but I think it's a trend that's kind of on the wane. You see less sagging these days, particularly the extreme sagging that I had in my PowerPoint. So yeah, it's something that came around probably maybe the early 90s up until maybe the late aughts. You still see it, but not the extreme sagging with the long white tee.
Why do you think it's leaving?
I don't know, I think people are getting tired of seeing it. I think there's a trend more for trimmer silhouettes.
Okay.
And I think that'll probably last for another 20 years, and then we'll probably move back to more billowing fabric again.
Okay. And in conjunction with, this idea of, the merce and what ideas it kind of elicits in the Black community, especially around this, I think Beauty Shop, 2005, so it was still a little shaky times. Why is certain fashion more associated with homosexuality in the Black community more or less than other communities?
I still think one thing that, Black folks in the U.S. really grapple with is respectability politics. And there's still this idea of, being, a proper man. And I think something like carrying a purse probably sort of flaunts respectability politics. Like, I'm going to wear my bag, I don't care. So I think that's part of it. I also think it's part of this sort of cult of hyper-masculinity that I think still is very potent in some communities, some Black communities in the U.S. So I think there's several dynamics going on with that.
Okay. I don't want to take up all the time. Questions now? Or they're going to pass out little note cards and whatnot. On the side, you have Lauren and Karen. And if you have any questions, please ask. Yeah. And I guess while everybody's getting their questions together, do you believe that the media plays a large part in, I guess, these constructs that the Black community has built around masculinity and kind of purporting sagging silhouettes for so long and rejecting the merce and things of that nature?
I think it's the media, and I think to a certain extent, I think it's certain politicians. In certain places, there's these campaigns, these initiatives to ban sagging. I don't know if you guys have seen this. There was one in Brooklyn by Eric Adams. He had a stop the sag, or some sort of ban the sag or something like that. So I think it's the media that sort of, one, vilifies the trend, but also sort of certain forms of media also sort of popularize it or valorize it. So again, I think it's a dialogue between like what people are wearing on the streets and the media and the government.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, actually.
Me? Lord.
Because, like I said, exhibitions aren't definitive, and you have to make decisions about what's included and what's not included. And I wonder, what did you want, or anyone from the class who's here can answer this question, but what did you want to be an exhibition that wasn't included for a number of reasons, whether because you couldn't come to a consensus, or it wasn't part of FIT's collection, or it was being borrowed by another institution?
Whoa. Full disclosure, we just get the answer. We don't necessarily get the details. But there is a process that we go through, and I know that one of the exhibitions that we were thinking about was about New York milliners, and trying to create a story around, New York City milliners and the fashion industry in the early part of the 20th century. And then the other one was geared toward fashions of the late 70s, Studio 54. But it was felt by the class in the museum that this exhibition would be more viable to kind of explain the larger part of fashion history based on the collection that they possess here. So, yeah, that's the short answer.
Were there any pieces in this particular exhibition that you wanted, and that for whatever reason weren't able to be included?
Oh my God, tons. No, well, it's interesting because the way the process works, we have different, with the help of Emma, shout out to Emma, we have several times to see the different objects that are pulled, and then also afterwards we have different tear sheets of objects that we didn't necessarily get to see in person, but we think would be a part of it. Like, for instance, the kimono, the Yamamoto kimono coat, that wasn't something that we initially seen. That was something we saw that she pulled up when we were trying to find more menswear garments to keep the balance between women's wear and menswear. And that was something that we as a class thought would be good. So, I mean, it wasn't so much, we didn't necessarily have that access to pick everything in the collection, but from what we saw, it was a group decision that we all band together. Okay, so questions. First, okay, so based on the first kind of point that we were talking about, the question here is, what are good research institutions that you have used in the past, you specifically? Because they were referencing the Negro Cloth in Frederick Douglass's autobiography. So something that I know you've mentioned before at some point in time in your own lectures, but what institutions have you used personally in the past to compile everything?
FIT. The Schomburg is a really great resource. NYPO, Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, New Orleans Historic Collection, Google. Also universities. I've been attached to several universities over the course of my adulthood, so it helps having some sort of affiliation to a university, because you have access to their archives, but also all the databases and library resources.
In your lecture, you discussed the cartoonist that did the man.
Edward Williams Clay. Yeah.
Edward William Clay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did he work for a newspaper?
He did, and actually that series, Life in Philadelphia, was published, I think, gosh, I'm going to forget the name of the newspaper, but it was, it's in the library company's archive, but I forget the name of it. It was published in Philadelphia. But yeah, it was published in the newspaper. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the question here is, did the fact that slaves made their own clothing have something to do with less pockets?
That's a good question. I mean, the image that I showed in my PowerPoint of the two-piece, the trousers and the jacket, actually included pockets in it. So I think when slaves had agency over their own clothing, they would include pockets, as knowing that having pockets was a privilege. When slaves were giving clothes, particularly field slaves, when they were giving sort of the very ragged, sort of rough garments, they were often pocketless. But domestic slaves often had pockets. One, because they did things that required them to have pockets, but also just because it was just a show of privilege and also their authority.
And I guess on that, was there a psychological difference when it came to pockets from slaves and freedmen, like African Americans who were born free versus African Americans who were born slaves? Was there, I guess, in their mind, a difference in terms of wanting pockets at some point in their life?
Well, they certainly wore clothing that had more pockets, and they had more agency over what they could wear. So they would choose more elaborate garments that had more finishings, finer fabrics, more pockets. They were more comfortable. So they definitely were more likely to have pockets in their clothing because they had more choice over what they were wearing, as opposed to a domestic slave or a field slave.
And the question here now is kind of still in the same realm, but can you expand on protective and hidden aspect of the pocket and how that relates to slave clothing?
I mean, I think the best example is that first slide I showed you from the Lydia Parrish book. So his first pair of pants, Shad Hall, was missing pockets because obviously slave owners feared that slaves were stealing crops or household items. So they would give their slaves clothing that didn't have pockets. On the same note, they would give domestic slaves sometimes clothing that had pockets. So I think it's all within like the system of punishment and rewards that sort of bolstered the slave system. Clothing, whether it was pocketed or not pocketed, sort of fit in with that system of control.
Now, was there any, I guess, major event, not major event, but was there any incident that compelled plantation owners in a way to forbid slaves of having pockets? Like, was there like a cutoff date, or was it just common practice and the word was spread, never let your slaves have pockets, if that makes sense?
No, it makes sense.
Okay.
I don't think there was any particular watershed moment. And of course, it wasn't necessarily like, I mean, some plantation owners allowed the slaves to have pockets, some didn't. So there was no like widespread common practice. It was just based on like common knowledge.
And then this final question, comparing the W.E. Du Bois image with later images of black men, the ones from the more contemporary images, how has the gesture of hands in pockets changed for black men?
I like this question. It's really good, actually. I gotta think about that. I mean, in the W.E. Du Bois image, it sort of conveys, his comfort, his ease, his authority, his self-possession. And I wouldn't say that changes over the course of at least my slideshow. The later images didn't necessarily show No, I think the men in the sagging photo actually had their hands in their pockets. But it is a protective act to sort of shield yourself or hide yourself or, protect yourself by putting your hands in your pocket. Also, just at the end of the day, pockets are functional. Like sometimes you want to keep your hands warm, and the way to do that is to throw them in your pockets. So I think there's several things going on. It's interesting to think about pockets on garments because on some level, you put a hood on your head because it keeps your head warm and it protects your head from moisture. You put your hands in your pocket because if your hands are cold, you want to protect them. But at the same time, it is a symbolic act. Like, experts of body language often think that putting your hands in your pocket is either like, you're hiding something or you're being shifty. And I think that trickles down into like everyday language. Like when you say someone has deep pockets, you mean they have a lot of money. So yeah, I think there's a lot of symbolic value in pockets, which makes your exhibition so wonderful and brilliant. But also it just comes down to the level of function, which goes back to the title of the exhibition.
But in keeping with that, do you feel that there is putting the hands in the pocket, especially like you bring up the example of like Trayvon Martin, and he was the story, he had his hands where he had his hands in his pocket with his food and stuff that he was walking from the convenience store. So in a way, why do you feel that, why is there association with black men, hands in pockets versus others?
Hands in pockets and hooded.
And hooded,
Yeah.
like why does that translate for black men but not for others
I think
in the same way?
when you're sort of hiding parts of your body, whether it's your hands or your head, for some people it makes you more menacing. Like if I'm walking around the city late at night and I'm wearing a hooded garment, even if it's 30 degrees, I won't put the hood up because I don't want to be targeted. So I think for a lot of people, like wearing a hood or putting your hands in your pocket or hiding part of your body sort of makes you more dangerous or menacing. And that's what happened in the case of, Trayvon Martin. If you were wearing like a racerback tank top, would he have been targeted? Who knows? But I think the hood made him, and I'm not sure what kind of bottoms he was wearing. I don't know if they were skinny jeans or baggy pants, but I think the hood sort of made him more menacing, made him more dangerous because he couldn't be identified.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much. Yeah. You could do your thing.
Thank you everyone for attending the event, and thank you to Dr. Jonathan Square again for joining us. We hope you'll make the trip across the street. Of course, the gallery is closed tonight, but it will be open during the day tomorrow and in future days until the 31st. Oh, it's open tonight. Oh, perfect. Okay, great. We hope you'll make your way across the street then to see the exhibition. Have a good evening.
Thank y'all.
It was good, yeah.